Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Abed Ayoub from ADC, and we appreciate you logging on and joining us for part of our 9/11 20th Anniversary Symposium. As you heard last week, and as we intended to do the symposium in person, but given the circumstances, it's moved to a virtual setting, which has its advantages, including allowing us to bring in some speakers to talk to you all who normally wouldn't be able to make it in person. So that's one plus. But today we're going to be covering and exploring the post-September 11th rise in anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, and anti-Asian hate. The conversation is going to include three prolific speakers and guests that joined us today. It's going to be streamed. It's being streamed currently live on Facebook. For those of you that are tuning in on the webinar, there's a question and answer box at the bottom, as well as a chat box. So you can post your questions and the speakers will answer them. I'm gonna moderate the session on behalf of ADC. This session is also sponsored in partnership with the Wayne State Law School, Damon Keith, the Damon Civil Rights and the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State. And I apologize, Khaled, I should have had that memorized, but we appreciate the support of Wayne State Law School. We also appreciate the support of the Proteus Fund, who is helping sponsor some of these, sponsor this program and the entire symposium. So I'm going to get started, just a few remarks about today's conversation and the overall intent of the symposium. And that is the 20th anniversary of 9/11 really gives us an opportunity to look back at the past 20 years and what's happened and where we are today. And when it comes to, hate crimes, anti-Arab sentiment, Islamophobia, and the current anti-Asian sentiment we're seeing, you can almost draw a direct trajectory from 9/11 to the wars we began seeing overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Ground Zero Mosque, the rise of the Tea Party, Donald Trump, and what we're seeing now with the post-Donald Trump era. And all these are connected. So you can't look at one of them and say, Donald Trump happened in a vacuum or this is an anomaly. In fact, what he brought is a product of not just 9/11, but years of policies and bigotry in this country that existed far before 9/11. But we will focus on the past 20 years and what that's done and how that's changed policies in different areas of our lives. Joining us, I'm going to give a brief introduction of our three speakers. Then I'm going to ask just an opening question to each. They're going to speak, give their perspective, and then we'll engage in a conversation. We have first with us Dr. Nazita Lajevardi. She is an attorney and assistant professor of political science at Michigan State University. She received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego in 2017, and her JD from University of San Francisco School of Law in 2012, and her BA from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2009. Her work focuses mainly on issues related to race, to religion, race, and ethnic politics, political behavior, voting rights, and immigration. Her writings have been published in venues such as Cambridge University Press, the Journal of Politics, American Political Science Review, Political Behavior, and the Journal of Race and Ethnic Studies. Also joining us is Dr. Vinay Harpalani, who is an associate professor of law at the University of New Mexico, School of Law, and Henry Weyhofen Professor. And I apologize if I mispronounced that. He focuses on the intersections between race, education, and law, and explores the nuances of racial diversity and identity from various disciplinary perspectives. His writings have covered topics such as affirmative action in university admissions, racial ambiguity, skin color discrimination, and the psychological development in racial identity. His law review article in 2012, Diversity Within Racial Groups and the Constitutionality of Race Consensus Admissions, was published in the University of Pennsylvania Journal of Constitutional Law and was cited in 8 US Supreme Court amicus briefs. And finally, Professor Khaled Beydoun, who's a dear friend of myself and of ADC, and we're thankful for his support and the support of the Damon Keith Justice Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State University, where he is currently the director. His full title, he's also Associate Professor of Law and the Associate Director of the Center. He's a leading scholar on national security, the war on terror, and civil rights. Beydoun is the author of the critically acclaimed American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, by the University of California Press and co-authored of Islamophobia and the Law, a critical reader published by Cambridge University, and has been published all over the place and is a regular contributor on our issues. Those are our speakers. So I'm going to open up with a quick question for Dr. Nazita, and allow you to jump in. But I want to start off in your book, recently published, Outsiders at Home. You took a deep dive, into hate crimes and into what we've seen over the past 20 years by looking at evidence and looking at specific examples. You put in a lot of effort into this book. If you could touch on what have we seen the past 20 years, and how's that led us to where we are today?
Absolutely. Well, assalamu alaikum. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for this wonderful privilege to be here today with you. I thank you for that question. I wrote a book that is called Outsiders at Home. And this book tried to paint a landscape of the types of discrimination that American Muslims face in a number of different venues in an ordinary American society. So I think that for a lot of scholars, for those of us who were interested in painting a portrait of what Muslims were experiencing, we found a lot of pushback initially. A lot of folks saying, well, there's not a lot of empirical evidence. We don't actually know if Muslims are being singled out or discriminated against. We don't actually empirically observe much of their experiences at all. So what you're saying, may not actually be as systematic as you say it is. So this book tried to fill that gap and to provide an empirical assessment of discrimination that Muslims have been facing by their elected representatives, how Muslims are being treated by the ordinary public, and how hostile attitudes that the American public holds is impactful in terms of shaping policy support that harms Muslims at home and abroad. And finally, what the book, I think the most perhaps important part of the book, if I were to pick one, is that it uses the news media to provide a historical landscape of when Muslims became salient over the past 25 years and how their media coverage shifted, from a pre-9/11 era to a post-9/11 era, and also how that compares to other racialized, stigmatized, minoritized, discriminated against groups in American politics. And largely what I find in this work is that 9/11 was a important turning point for many of us, but it took some time for the news media to begin singling out American Muslims. And when it did, the path was sort of charted at that point. American Muslims in 2016 appeared in 1/3 of all media coverage that aired on CNN, a little less than 1/3 on Fox, and over 40% of coverage that aired on MSNBC. And so you have to realize that American Muslims, first start off as this group in a pre-9/11 era. Muslims in general start off as a group in the pre-9/11 era that's not really being covered in the news media. And all of a sudden, nearly 20 years later, you see American Muslims are repeatedly being shown and communicated to the American public, right? They are visible to the American public. Moreover, their coverage not only is so high in volume, it's more negative than that of other typically stigmatized groups. So not only is the American public seeing a lot of images of Muslims, a lot of tropes, a lot of stereotypes of American Muslims, of Muslims in general, but the information that's being communicated to them is largely negative. And that is, of course, problematic, because not only then is the media, this platform in which it's depicting information, it's making a choice on what kind of information to communicate about American Muslims to the public. And I think we need to really think about the tone, sentiment, volume of coverage that has changed over time, and that has really made Muslims more salient to the American public and more visible, perhaps in more danger.
Thank you, and appreciate that. And we will post a links to the books. There was a question about posting some of the links, so we will post a link to the book and other resources that our speakers do mention today. I want to turn to Dr. Vinay and ask you a question. In your writings and in your work and what you're doing now, what are you seeing with happening with 9/11, COVID-19, and race, particularly not just with the discrimination faced by Muslims, but by Arabs as well and Asians? What connection are you seeing over the 20 years to where we are today?
Yeah, thank you, Abed. And I'm, just really glad to just be a part of this conversation. I think the connection, I'll start out broadly and kind of go through more specific history, is really all of these groups are viewed as un-American foreigners who are invading this country and just bringing it down in different ways. And there's different symbols, different ways that they're viewed as foreigners. And I'll get into that a little bit. So what I want to do is, going back to 9/11, and a lot of the things that kind of took off after 9/11 were happening before 9/11 in terms of violence and prejudice and all that stuff against Muslims, Arabs. But also targeted after 9/11 were South Asian Americans, people whose ancestry derives from the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, etc. A number of different reasons for this. Why were South Asian Americans being conflated with Arabs and Muslims? Well, you have this kind of superficial similarity in physical appearance. I get mistaken for Arab all the time. I get mistaken for Italian sometimes in different contexts, but often mistaken for Arab. So people think we look alike or we have some superficial similarities. There are cultural symbols like the turban, the beard, which especially Sikh Americans are targeted on those bases. People think that they're Muslim because of the beards and turbans. And a number of other things like national origin. That's an example from my parents, actually. They were stopped at an airport and searched shortly after 9/11. And the reason was, they grew up in India, they're Indian, but their birthplace before partition was Pakistan. So their passports listed Pakistan as their birthplace. So you have this conflation of South Asian and Arab, conflating Arab with Muslim, thinking all Muslims are Arab, whereas the majority of Arab Americans are actually not Muslim, they're Christian. I believe it's a slight majority. So this is a conflation of ethnicity and language with religion. And then, of course, associating Muslim with terrorists. Muslims are all terrorists. That's, of course, a racist sentiment and ideological misarticulation of Islam. So you have both South Asian Americans and Arab Americans and groups that kind of look similar being targeted. The irony here is that Arab and South Asian Americans are in different racial categories in these census. South Asian Americans are classified in the Asian American category. Arab Americans are classified as white. And there's a whole history to that. South Asian Americans have been classified in different ways in these census, different racial categorizations. I've written about what I call the racial ambiguity of South Asian Americans. As far as Arab Americans, there's been a movement to reclassify from whites because classifying them as white does not capture their experiences, right? I mean, all the discrimination does not allow that to be captured. So kind of an irony there. And it kind of shows how race is socially constructed, malleable. These two groups are targeted, have been targeted since 9/11 and even before 9/11, based on all these perceived commonalities. These racist attacks when they're classified different racially. Now, how does this relate to COVID-19 related crimes that have taken off since the pandemic took off? Well, as I said, these are just both different symbols of foreignness, un-Americanness. I kind of went into some of the ones that are associated with the Arab and South Asian Americans. The COVID-19 related crimes, people are perceived as Chinese, East Asian Americans. China is blamed for the pandemic. So different kind of association there. South Asian Americans are not quite as targeted for COVID-19, even though they're classified as Asian Americans. And that goes to, who do people identify as quote unquote Asian, and where does that come from? And I think, the main feature there is the epicanthic eye folds with single eyelids or monolids, the eyes that are associated with East Asian Americans. And I'm careful about how I describe that because there are a lot of offensive terms to describe that eye shape. But I asked a number of people, took a little survey, epicanthic eye folds with monolids or single eyelids seems to be the best way that's non-offensive. So you have these different ways that people are viewed as foreigners, as un-American, which I think is kind of the common theme there. But this also, COVID-19 also kind of goes into racial classification problems with the Asian American category. because South Asian Americans are part of that category, but maybe racialized differently, maybe targeted under different circumstances. And if we're looking at racist acts, racism, we have to think about how we're collecting data. How do we stop these types of attacks? What do we need to do to address them? So it problematizes the whole idea of racial categories and how we construct those. And that's something I write a lot about, that I'm really interested in. And later on in the chat, I will share some of my work on that. I think I'll stop there. Let Khaled.
Thank you. Thank you, and I appreciate your remarks and your work. So I'm going to turn, to Professor Khaled Beydoun, who's no stranger to ADC, and we appreciate always your support to the community, to the organization. Over the past 20 years, Khaled, you've put in a lot of work on the academic side. You published a book, Islamophobia, American Islamophobia, as well as a number of other pieces. And in your perspective, the rise of Islamophobia, the rise of anti-Arab sentiment, what is the connection? I mean, was 9/11, the catalyst that, led to the Islamophobia we see today? And how does the anti-Arab sentiment, play into that in the categories, that were mentioned earlier, the racial categories? I mean, it seems like it's just a growing monster, the Islamophobia as itself, and just a growing definition as we keep, moving along the timeline. But just your perspective on your book, the past 20 years, what you think.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Abed, and thanks to ADC for staging this event, and to Vinay and Nazita, whose work I really appreciate, and that really, feeds my own work. There's a brilliant article that was written a year after the 9/11 terror attacks. I was still a law student, by a law scholar by the name of Letty Volpe. The piece is called "The Citizen and the Terrorist." And one of the more salient observations Volpe makes in that piece is to say that the 9/11 terror attacks redeployed longstanding Orientalist tropes. Really important thesis and observation Volpe makes, because what she's essentially saying is that 9/11 did not, create novel stereotypes. It did not sort of engineer or manufacture, any kind of new narratives or misrepresentations about who Arab were, who Muslims were, or who folks from the Middle East, how they menaced the United States. These were deeply entrenched and deeply rooted in the imagination of specifically American legal institutions. And we can, obviously, when we talk about the racialization of Muslims and, the sloppy conflation of Arab and Muslim identity with South Asian identity, we always have to spearhead that conversation with Orientalism, right? The work of Edward Said, who essentially lays out this master discourse for how people from the quote unquote Orient, the Arab or the Muslim worlds, were painted really broadly as the existential antithesis of who the West and Westerners were. And these tropes, these stereotypes about who Arab and Muslims were, again, and Vinay and I, when we were young academics, were published in the same NYU journal. He published a piece on the racialization of South Asians, and I published a piece on the racialization of Arab Americans. And all of these stereotypes that exist today that really feed modern Islamophobia as we know it, in the American experience, find their roots in the naturalization era. And this naturalization era, which existed from 1790 until 1952, mandated whiteness as a prerequisite for citizenship. And as a consequence of that racialization, and I think what's really key and what I'd really like to ferret out in this conversation is how whiteness and white supremacy really, steers and shapes the conversation around who Arab are and who Muslims are. Even today, with this rise in white anxiety that obviously Trump and before him the Tea Party had really, peddled into the fore. But during this era, whiteness initially meant Protestantism, and it meant Christianity. And the large number of Arab who came, initially speaking, were Christian, and many of them were able to become naturalized citizens and found to be white on grounds of their Christian identity. Muslim identity, on the other hand, was racialized to be not only non-white, but anti-white. The fact that you were Muslim effectively disqualified you from becoming naturalizable because you were not white and un-American. And these tropes and these stereotypes, which were rooted centuries ago during the naturalization era, rose to the fore after the 9/11 terror attacks to essentially cement the idea that Muslim identity was not only threatening to American society. And, you know, when we talk about American society in the mainstream, the crux is always whiteness, but very much the civilizational, the cultural, and finally the political antithesis of American identity. So modern Islamophobia, as we know it, is built upon the template of Orientalism. And even more than that, especially early on after 9/11, our understanding of who Arab were and who Muslims were and who South Asians were was very sloppy. And oftentimes the divisions across these, you know, really rich and heterogeneous groups merged and blurred. That's why it was it was no surprise that Sikh Americans were the first victims and the first individuals and communities attacked after the 9/11 terror attacks. That's why it was no surprise that even if you were Arab Christian, Arab identity effectively conflated you with being Muslim, rendering Arab Christians and Iranians and Turks and Armenians, a whole host of groups that are sloppily conflated with Arab and Muslim identity, were victimized by Islamophobia. So when we talk about modern Islamophobia today, and I offer a definition in my book, broadly speaking, when we think about private Islamophobia in the minds of popular society and private individuals, it's still very sloppy in the sense that they caricature anybody with brown skin who sort of fits within this imagined sort of caricature of who looks to be Muslim is going to be vulnerable to the anti-Muslim animus that rises from hate mongers. So I think it's critical, and that's why I published my book, and that's why Nazita's book is so trenchant and such an important read. Is that we have to understand that Islamophobia is by no means, cogent and monolithic. It breaks down and is deployed distinctly from state actors, from private actors, and by private institutions. And I'm happy to have this conversation, especially with regard to how Islamophobia converges with white supremacy and whiteness in the present day.
Thank you, Khaled. It's appreciated. I'm gonna ask a follow-up question. Dr. Nazita, I think you wrote about this in your book, but when it comes to policy, what was Islamophobia, this anti-Arab sentiment, what role did these feelings play in driving policy in the first, immediate aftermath of 9/11 in the following years as well? What were you able to find?
Yeah.
And I also open, if anybody, Khaled and Vinay, if you want to jump in as well.
Yeah, I want to just point out something that, I think that as survey researchers, you start to understand who has value in society based on the groups and policies and ideas that are being surveyed and tested on, which is all to say that prior to 9/11, there exist only 3 publicly available surveys that ask about attitudes towards Islam, Muslims, or Muslim Americans. Which is also to say that we can't actually have a good baseline of what anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic values or ideas might be prior to that era. And then subsequently post 9/11, it took time before people started to pose questions about anti-Muslim attitudes. And I think that when they did ask these questions about Muslims, frankly, the questions were sloppy. There weren't enough people who were conscious of the American Muslim population and asking questions that I think really captured the stereotypes and very unique experiences of Muslims in American academia. But there were plenty of people doing very important work on anti-Muslim hate in Europe, who have developed Muslim-specific measures, thinking very critically about the experiences of Muslims as a racialized other in the European context. And from there, I was able to build and really just adapt a lot of measures that already existed in this literature to the American context. And so I want to just be very, very clear. I want to say this once and say it clearly. Apart from partisanship, anti-Muslim attitudes were the single most important predictor of Trump support in 2016. Baseline, after partisanship, anti-Muslim attitudes were the single most important predictor of Trump support in 2016. So yes, anti-Muslim attitudes matter. They matter for politics, and they also matter for policy. Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiment, or what I call the Muslim American resentment scale, These attitudes predict support for anti-Sharia laws. They predict support for banning Muslims from owning weapons, from building mosques in places, from even banning hijab. So they have numerous policy consequences. And if you look around the states, for instance, anti-Sharia law is just one example of these types of laws. They're being advanced in state legislatures all over the country, and that's not dying down, And so, yes, anti-Muslim attitudes, they matter. As Khaled very, very aptly pointed out, they are rooted in Orientalist tropes. They're not new. Islamophobia has existed in this country since the day enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to this country against their will. And so to some degree, Islamophobia has manifested here under a system of white supremacy. And so if I may, I just kind of want to piggyback off of what Khaled was saying about white supremacy and like where we're at today and how this matters for Islamophobia, 20 years post 9/11, if you're going to focus in on this point. I think a lot of us know that there's been a rise of hate crimes. We all heard, right, the Southern Poverty Law Center sort of in the aftermath of the 2016 election coming through and saying, oh, look at this rise in hate crimes. Well, yeah, there was a massive rise in hate crimes that targeted many groups. Muslims were among those groups. And the question is like, how did those hate crimes, how did online hate speech really get activated? And so there's a lot of research that's happening right now and looking at what's activating a lot of the far right discussions about American Muslims, and they're linking it all to elite rhetoric, right? This is all tied to like political elites that are actually activating these online communities, these online filter bubbles and alt-right communities, which you see a link, right, when between discussion of Muslims on these platforms to the experiences offline that they're enduring. And so you cannot divorce the experiences and the threat to Muslim lives right now in the United States from white supremacy.
Thank you. And I don't know, Khaled or Vinay, if you want to jump in on that one. Okay.
I'll say this really briefly. I think, the current attack on critical race theory is really interesting because it follows the same sort of framework strategy, includes many of the same elements that were over the last 10 to 12 years attacking Sharia. So there's an intimate connection between white anxiety, white supremacy, and Islamophobia along those two fronts.
Right.
I guess I'll just add a couple of brief points. I meant to say this in my earlier presentation, but I did say, majority of Arab Americans are Christian. I believe about 45% of Muslims in America are Black American. So, you have kind of a connection there also to, I think, white supremacy and kind of a whole history of how that happens. I mean, and I'm learning a lot from Nazita and Khaled's comments also. And Nazita mentioned kind of the whole European context. Well, think about how far back Islamophobia goes there. I mean, we're talking about back to the Middle Ages, the Crusades, and Christianity and Islam being diametrically opposed to each other far before the US was even founded. And I think, just the role of that being transposed, I mean, this goes back a long ways.
Right. And, Dr. Nazita, what you said about the attitudes being a predictor, the anti-Muslim attitudes being a predictor of a Trump supporter will kind of let you draw the parallel as to why the Muslim ban was probably the first, was one of the first actions he took in office. I mean, it plays to the base. But a question just came in, and, I'm going to ask some questions, but I do want to ask this one because I like this question and I like when we discuss it. But when it comes, we're hitting on Trump and hitting what it seems to be the GOP. But over the past 20 years, a lot of liberal or progressive institutions also dabbled in a little bit of, Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiment, anti-Asian hate. So, is there, basically the question, is there racism happening in these liberal and progressive circles? And, how do you go about calling it out?
For anyone who reads my book, I think it's in the second page, I criticize Hillary Clinton for her comments during a presidential debate when she was running for office, right? She announced during a presidential debate that the utility of American Muslims is in their ability to serve as America's eyes and ears, as if the only utility that American Muslims have is on their ability to detect terrorism, because we're a security threat, because we're a cultural threat, and we're able to discern it from one another. By emphasizing the differences, the marked differences between American Muslims and every other group of Americans that's out there, and in making it related to some sort of security threat, she otherized Muslims and she validated concerns about a security threat. And so yeah, I don't think that just because you have a Democratic representative, you're going to be served better or be more actually, descriptively or substantively represented. I don't think that's necessarily true, especially for American Muslims. In my book, I have 2 studies that I ran on state legislators asking for constituent services, and I show that across 2 different studies on the universe of state legislators in America, that Muslims are underrepresented compared to their counterparts, and that this trend exists among Democrats as well. And so, we shouldn't take anything for granted, and political exclusion can also certainly come at the hands of liberal and progressive representatives.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind that a lot of the policies passed under the Bush administration were supported by both parties. The Patriot Act almost unanimously. And some of these policies were still kept in place by the Obama administration, and Sears wasn't eliminated until the 11th hour. And I truly believe, had Donald Trump not been elected, had Hillary Clinton come in, you still would have seen NSEERS on the book. So it's interesting on how on how that played out. I don't know, Khaled or Vinay, if you have anything to add to that. If not, I'll just jump into the next question. But something came in on Khaled. This question came into you, and I know it's specific to Arabs, but what happened with Arab identity over the past 20 years? And actually, the question reads: Can you have Khaled explain the roller coaster ride of Arab identity from post 9/11 through the Arab Spring into today?
I mean, it's a really complex question. I think that within the American racial landscape, Arabs have perpetually been liminals. They haven't had a formal and fixed sort of space along the racial taxonomy, which leads to a lot of confusion, which leads to a lot of inability to organize along a strategic and streamlined fashion. I think that what you had post 9/11, I mean, pre 9/11 within Arab spaces, you had a strong pan-Arabist consciousness, right? The idea that Arabs from various countries, Palestine, Egypt, Algeria, and so on and so forth, were uniting under the common ground of kindred Arab identity. Some exceptions, obviously, but I'm painting a broad picture. Post 9/11, in the aftermath of 9/11, specifically the war on terror, machine that came forth led to a renewed racialization amongst Arab Americans and non-Arab Muslim groups to adopt Muslim identity as the sort of like focal identity marker moving ahead. I think Arab identity right now is in some ways perplexed by those 2 currents, other currents obviously, but also how the racialization of religion informs individual identity. What you had post 9/11 with many, Arab Christians, for instance, and secular Arabs, for instance, is to strategically disassociate themselves from Muslim identity as a way to stave off popular animus, but also to stave off governmental surveillance. That was also true for many Arab Muslims, right? Arab Muslims who wanted to suppress their outward expression of Muslim identity as a strategy to stave off suspicion from the state and animus from private actors was also another current. But I think right now, there's been somewhat of a resurgence of American identity, to be frank with you, revitalized amongst not only young people in the United States, but academics, intellectuals, and you see that most manifestly through a desire to finally establish a racial designation on the census. Abed, we had some movement in 2015, 2016 around the possible creation of the MENA, the Middle Eastern North African designation, which was eventually unsuccessful. But there's still a grassroots and activist push for that to happen in 2030. My belief is, and you see this with the Asian American designation, the Latinx designation on the census. Having a cogent classification on the census enables forms of organizing, coalition, and advocacy, which makes it easier to build a common identity along Arab lines. But I think that's an essential prerequisite.
Thank you for that, Khaled. And it's important to note that after 9/11, there was not a category for anti-Arab hate crimes on the DOJ form. So there was no way to track those. The interesting part is that category did exist in the 80s and 90s, but it was removed by the DOJ, and through efforts we had at ADC, that category was ultimately put back sometime around 2011 or 2012. So you are right. There's always it's hard to track these. And it's something that the community pushed for, and there is a movement within the Arab community more on the identity side, but that's a whole other session we can have, but I did want to get that question in there. Vinay, another question coming in, is about the rate of hate crimes against the Sikh community. And, would you say, from your experiences, would you say it's confusion, they're confusing them for Muslims, or do enough people know, who Sikhs are? What role do you think, what's the intersections you see with, what's happening with the Sikh community? I know you touched on it, but there was a request for you to elaborate on it a little bit more that came in from Facebook.
Sure. I mean, I do think, the knowledge of who Sikhs are, there's not much of it. I mean, Americans tend not to be aware of these things. And if you think about just these stereotypes, the cultural symbols, Sikhs have beards. I mean, that's part of the whole, religion. Sikhs wear turbans, tie their turbans in very particular ways. So in some sense, you can maybe say they're even more quote unquote Muslim in appearance, or stereotypical Muslim, what people associate with it than any other group, really. I mean, you're going to have a beard, you're going to have the turban. So that, I mean, in that sense, I mean, they're going to continue to be targeted. So I think it's related to those symbols. I want to just kind of piggyback off of one of Khaled's comments about distancing oneself from this Muslim identity. I mean, that happens in other communities also, among South Asian Americans, among Sikh Americans. I think Bobby Jindal once said something like, "I'm not a Muslim," when people were talking about him. And, Hindu South Asians also say, I'm not a Muslim. And it also, another theme that's kind of coming out of this conversation I hadn't thought about as much, is just how much Islamophobia from other places, other countries, kind of transposes into the US context. I mean, with, say, South Asian Hindus, there's the whole conflict between Hindus and Muslims within India and all the crazy stuff that Narendra Modi is doing. So, I think that's something to think about also, and I'm sure Khaled and Nazita have thought about it a lot, but it's something I think coming out of this conversation that I maybe had not thought about quite as much.
Thank you. Actually, Khaled, I'm going to follow up with the last comment he made. You wrote your book, American Islamophobia, but what role did 9/11 play in what we're, a global Islamophobia that we're seeing?
Look, so I mean, the 9/11 terror attacks, man, it's crazy, man. It's like almost 20 years ago coming up. I feel hella old. But it established, it not only established policing and surveillance on Muslim communities, but I think far more broadly, it established the surveillance architecture that exists, that affects all communities today in the United States. And I think second, beyond surveillance in the United States, today, what the war on terror did, legally speaking, right? So, and I write about this in my book, and Nazita writes about it in her work as well, is that it's important to think about law, the Patriot Act, NSEERS, the Muslim ban, the Total Information Act, Sharia legislation. These are far more than, pieces of paper with technical provisions on how to police and how to punish and how to, enforce immigration. Law is also a dialectic. Law is also a communique. Law endorses stereotypes and endorses representations and misrepresentations of who people are. So if the United States after 9/11, and obviously the war on terror is a global war on terror where George Bush spent many of the first months and years campaigning across the world, stumping across the world to form alliances with heads of government across the world. That body of law, all these bodies of law that we're talking about that are built upon the common baseline that expressions of Muslim identity are correlative with a propensity for terrorism, right? That is legitimizing every foreign government's interest, converging interests, and I'll raise the name up of Derek Bell in interest convergence here, to say that governments, some of them previously already committed to persecuting Muslims in the case of China and France, for instance, and India, obviously, and other governments which were beginning burgeoning campaigns to persecute and crack down on their Muslim communities. What the war on terror did, what every body of law that we talked about did, was it provided these governments with the legal legitimacy and the green light to not only intensify their persecution and crackdown of Muslims, but to get the rubber stamp from the United States, which is the global hegemon, and then obviously the global beacon of democracy. So it's critical to think about the war on terror as far more than just this, political warmongering and legal machine. It also was this grand narrative built upon this baseline of vilifying Muslims that enabled and accelerated other governments to, crack down, oftentimes in more ominous ways. If you look at what's happening in China, for instance, or even in India, persecute Muslims in ways that I think even transcend what's happening here stateside.
Thank you, Khaled. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that one. Question, Dr. Nazita. Again, I'm going to, go back to your book and reference your book a few times, and we'll send the link out to the attendees and registrants. But you mentioned, the media portrayals. And one question that came in is, has it gotten better? Actually, the question is, has it gotten better? Are some of these quote unquote token representations actually doing anything in the media?
So media depictions of marginalized groups ebb and flow. So during presidential election years, you get just a greater volume of marginalized groups in the news media. You just see a trend where you see these increases in portrayals. However, so the volume ebbs and flows. When you're in a presidential election year, you're going to see more representations. But I want to just kind of be clear that the tone of coverage, I think, is the most important piece here, and the tone remains negative. And so that is to say that when they are represented, the representations are negative. Now, the 2016 presidential election campaign was an unprecedented time. We were talking about a Syrian civil war. We were talking about terrorist attacks that were occurring, all over the world, but really also in Western Europe, in the United States, and a presidential campaign in which, you really had candidates on both sides of the aisle raising Muslims in everyday campaign events. And so American Muslims, foreign Muslims, they were being communicated regularly to the American public at these unprecedented levels. And that's not happening as much, obviously, especially with the rise of COVID-19, for instance, right? And with, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, Muslims have, they're not getting as much press coverage as before. But, Orientalism is strongly rooted. And so when they are being portrayed, like those portrayals are negative, there is some positive news here. I don't want you guys to think that I just have negative news to deliver. I want to share some positive news, which is that positive portrayals, there's a bit of mixed results here in the literature that I find. So in the midst of 2016, when, actually right around the time of the Orlando shooting, their positive coverage of Muslims did not improve attitudes that people held about Muslims. So exposure to positive things that Muslims were doing did nothing for people. But when terrorism isn't as big of a issue on people's minds, positive coverage can in fact improve attitudes at times. And so I think context matters. It always matters. We're in an ever evolving state of the world. We're not going to have one formal model that's going to explain every single human interaction. But I think we can take a lesson learned there, which is that yes, there is something that we can do about it, which is to give more balance and more nuance and more representational weight, in fact, to events that are occurring, and realize that the media is a business, and that it provides sensationalist coverage to attract viewers, to keep their viewership up. And so sensationalism and negative coverage is going to keep people in. Psychologically, we store negative information, we privilege negative information. When we hear it, we hold on to it tighter. It activates our fight or flight responses. And so the way that we process negative information is something very much that these media conglomerates have taken into their business models. And so, we have to be a bit more critical, I think, when we think about those representations. But it's not all doom and gloom. But that is to say that negative coverage is powerful, and it's ever present. And I think that it's not getting, frankly, enough attention. If we think that we're not holding our cable news companies, we're not holding them to account. Just imagine what we're doing with social media.
Exactly. I'm going to throw a question out there since we have three attorneys and legal scholars. Khaled, you mentioned the law, but really right now with the makeup of the Supreme Court, with what we're seeing happening to voting rights and what we're seeing happening state legislatures across the country on a local level. And it seems that, unfortunately right now, yes, Trump was voted out of office, but it seems that the far right is actually winning. And is the law, or the courts and the law, are those going to be viable options in the future if you have a 7-2 Supreme Court, if you have state, the state courts and the appellate courts, leaning towards the far right? What options do we have available, and how much danger are we in to actually, losing any credibility the courts have left in this country, which are usually the avenue we use to get rid of these policies across the board? What kind of danger are we in right now in this moment, in that area? And I'm just putting that out there for anybody to jump in.
Vinay, feel free to jump in, or Nazita, feel free.
I actually wanted to address the previous question a little bit, but
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, the Supreme Court is not going to be helpful at all in this situation. I don't see anything there. I don't know if Khaled or Nazita do, but I guess just a brief answer there. Yeah, that's going to be a huge problem there in terms of just any civil rights legislation or efforts. Let me just say something about the prior question, or maybe it's not really related to the prior question, but tangentially. But this is a great conversation. It makes me think of all kinds of things when we talk about, these stereotypes, these media representations. And just again, part of my role on the panel is connecting 9/11 to COVID-19. So, we know all these stereotypes of Muslims and, this misarticulation of what jihad means and terrorists, and people have images of suicide bombers and they're going to do this here, all this stuff. And I think similarly, what we're seeing with COVID-19 is, the blame on China that, this virus, they created this virus. It's kind of an act of, bioterrorism. We think back to, I don't know if you're familiar with the whole Wen Ho Lee incident back around 2001, where he was a nuclear scientist and people accused him of being a spy in that context. These are very consistent with these stereotypes of Asian Americans, that, they're involved in science, they're really good at science. And China could do something like this. They could create a virus in one of the labs and, send it over here just to create a pandemic here. So it's interesting, I think, how these different stereotypes play into the way that different groups are viewed as a threat, are viewed as foreigners, and what their kind of the nature of the threat is.
Yeah, I'll say really briefly about the trajectory of the court, specifically the Supreme Court. If anybody wants sort of a quick assessment as to where the federal courts stand, I highly recommend you read the majority opinion in Hawaii versus Trump, right? So regardless of all the brazen rhetoric, the Islamophobia, the anti-Arab sentiment that was coming not only from the mouth of Trump, but many of his acolytes, that the conservative marrow of the Supreme Court, which is expanding like Abed observed, was willing to sort of divorce all of that from analyzing the executive order, right? So they upheld the executive order on grounds that the president had the plenary power, even though when enforcing that plenary power, the president was saying things like Islam hates us and Syrian refugees are ISIS and Muslims are intruders and things of that nature. So the scary thing is that the conservative wing, not all of it, because the conservative wing of the Supreme Court is by no means monolithic, but the element of it that is concerning uses, jurisprudential tools like originalism and textualism as a pretext to just entrench and solidify the status quo and to feed, white anxiety. And we saw that. And, another piece to read if you want a more sort of, accurate analysis of what really happened is Judge Sotomayor's dissent in the same case. That you really can't divorce law from the actions and the rhetoric of presidents and state actors. But yeah, Abed, it's a bleak portrait. And you led your question with saying that Trump is out of office. I wouldn't be so optimistic, because what might happen in 2 years with what's taking place in this country might be a restoration of maybe not Trump, but maybe in fact Trumpism. So we haven't moved entirely away from that movement having hold of, at least the executive branch.
Well, look, I believe Trumpism is just made possible by 9/11. I truly believe that a lot of what we saw after 9/11, and he's a salesman, and he just picked up on what was happening and pushed it. So Trumpism was birthed 20 years ago in New York City when it happened, and he was on the networks and he was out there, and I think the man planned it out and knows what, as dumb as people say he isn't really that dumb. I think he knows what he's doing, and you possibly could see a run in 2 years. But I know we're running up against the hour. We don't have a hard deadline, but I don't want to keep everybody on. But on that note, with Trumpism, with the new set of challenges we see, what do you, for each of you, just in closing, what do you foresee moving forward when it just comes to hate crimes, the depictions of our communities, and the challenges we're going to face, not just in the next 2 years, but beyond that? And how similar are they going to be to what we faced immediately after 9/11, as opposed to maybe being something on steroids that's a bigger threat to our rights and liberties and safety in this country? So Vinay, if you want to jump in and go first, and then we'll just go from there.
Yeah, I mean, Khaled mentioned Trump v. Hawaii, and I think it's ironic that Trump v. Hawaii said that they overturned Korematsu. And remember, that's another commonality with Asian Americans. Go back to Korematsu after Pearl Harbor, and just people, they said they overturned it. People say it will be different today, but just think about the level of hysteria that there was after Pearl Harbor. How much of a threat Japan was viewed as. And how would that be viewed today? Well, I think with Islamophobia, 9/11, we're kind of seeing, if Pearl Harbor happened today, would it really turn out different? I think, this is kind of, these historical parallels are interesting. I think in terms of just looking forward, I think we also have to think about just the entire changing demographics of the US. And Abed and I talked about this a little bit before the panel even started. But look at Islamophobia in that context. It's kind of a broader fear of just how America is changing, how that's a threat to white privilege, white supremacy, just white American identity. We don't look the same as we did, even at the time of 9/11. We are moving in that direction, and it's interesting. As we get further from 9/11, you might think, well, this is maybe not in people's minds quite as much, but it's expanded, and it's part of the broader context of what's happening to America. Mentioned the census data came out yesterday and showing, we're becoming less white even faster than was originally predicted. And then in this whole context, kind of going back to Asian Americans, we have COVID-19. So we have all these reasons, from the white supremacist perspective to fear what's happening. And I see that connection. 9/11 was a big one. COVID-19 was a big one. This is really a clash that's going to continue to happen. And we see, the polarization. We see everything going on.
Thank you. Dr. Nazita, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm very good at predicting. I never would have predicted COVID-19. So here we are still on Zoom. But, I think the most important, I'm an attorney, but I'm also a race scholar. And so to me, I don't think you have race in America without law. And that's why I think the biggest challenge moving forward is about voting rights, and it's about representation in this country. I think there are groups that are systematically, historically excluded, intentionally excluded from institutions that, I think very problematically think are democratic. And you see that right now in the efforts to restore parts of the Voting Rights Act and the opposition to it. Just today, Hansi Lo Wang, who works with the US Census, identified numerous issues with the 2020 census and undercounts of minority populations. So, when the US Census is undercounting minority populations, that affects not only, where federal dollars go, but also who represents these groups. It affects who gets to have elected representatives in office who go and vote for the bills to increase the voting rights of these populations. And so these institutions are made to historically exclude, they're made to underrepresent people of color. And I think the most important battle that lies ahead of us is how to preserve the voices of minorities in American democracy. I think really the health of American democracy is at stake. And I think race is the most central feature of American democracy. And if we really don't understand that now, I think we're going to be in for a sore awakening in 2 years.
Thank you. And Khaled?
Yeah, so two things that I've been thinking about. The first thing, obviously is the shape and character of counter-radicalization and surveillance moving ahead. I know the Biden administration is spending a lot of time and energy, at least politically, looking to mount a more robust response to white supremacy and white terror-related violence, and form a new sort of surveillance mandate around that. There's a lot of justified skepticism and opposition because there's precedent. We know, for us who are old enough in the room, know that after the Oklahoma City bombing, EDPA, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which came as a result of that bombing by white terror actors, was deployed specifically against Arab and Muslim Americans. And there's that fear that even if the Biden administration launches surveillance against whites, that it's functionally going to be deployed against Arab and Muslims moving ahead. So that's something I've been tracking closely and thinking about. A lot of communities of color are obviously proponents of a surveillance program that fixates on white supremacists and white terror actors, and how that positions Arabs and Muslims moving ahead is interesting given that precedent. The second thing that I think about is what Nazita talked about earlier, is how Islamophobia is perpetuated by the left. During the Trump moment, Muslims by and large, kind of emerged as the new social and racial justice darlings of the left. You see that kind of retrenching now. It's diminishing in the sense that the broader left is less concerned with Islamophobia. Now that Trump is out of office, people think that Islamophobia is over, right? Trump is gone, Islamophobia is done. But there's a lot of uncomfortable racial and religious capitalism taking place by the left. It's kind of the new tokenization where there's been an uplifting of Arab and Muslim figures and narratives and stories that neatly align with what is sensible to the establishment left, and specifically the white left. which I think in the coming future is going to create new obstacles and challenges for the Arab and Muslim community.
Thank you, Khaled. And, I'm going to wrap it up here, but I want to thank the speakers again. I think this was a great conversation. We can definitely keep it going, and I'm sure we'll have each of you back with us. For our attendees, we're going to email a recap, and we'll include a link to all the, all the information that was shared and mentioned. In closing, I want to just remind everybody to tune in next week, sign up, because we're going to have 3 or 4 more of these sessions as we examine the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the impact it's had in different areas. I believe next week we're going to have a conversation about the impact, a longer conversation about the media and how Arabs and Muslims were impacted in the media and the role that played as well as upcoming conversations on immigration and mental health related to the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Do sign up for that. Also keep in mind the ADC West Coast Conference is taking place October 8th and 9th, the Alex Ode Memorial Conference in Anaheim, California. God willing, if COVID allows it to happen, we will be there for our first in-person event in over a year. So hopefully that works out. So again, I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank Wayne State Law School, the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, Khaled for bringing them on board and helping spread this message, as well as for the Proteus Rise Fund for their continued support for such programs. It's greatly appreciated. So thank you all for joining us. I appreciate it, and we will talk soon. Take care.